Detroit, 1971. Studio A at Hitsville. USA was silent in the way that only happens when something is about to go wrong. It was 11 p.m., and the Funk Brothers had been waiting for 2 hours. James Jamerson sat with his Fender Precision bass resting against his knee, occasionally plucking a single note that died in the soundproofed air. Benny Benjamin was at the drums, spinning a stick between his fingers, his expression unreadable. Earl Van Dyke sat at the piano, playing nothing, just staring at the keys like they might tell him something about what was coming. They were there to record "Let's Get It On," but none of them believed in it. Not yet. Marvin Gaye was late. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the conversation happening in the control room while they waited. Gordy had brought in the Funk Brothers specifically for this session because he was worried. Marvin had been different since Tammy Terrell died. Withdrawn, erratic. His last album, What's Going On, had been a miracle of stubbornness, Marvin forcing it into existence against Motown's wishes. Now he wanted to make another album about sex and spirituality, and Gordy didn't know if Marvin still had it in him. So Gordy made a decision. He told the Funk Brothers to push Marvin. Hard. He wanted them to create an arrangement so aggressive, so masculine, so overwhelming that it would force Marvin to prove he could still command a room. Gordy believed that if Marvin could rise to meet the Funk Brothers' intensity, then maybe the old Marvin, the Prince of Soul, the smooth romantic who sold millions, was still in there somewhere. But if Marvin couldn't handle it, if he folded under pressure, then Gordy would know that What's Going On had been a fluke, and Marvin was finished. The Funk Brothers weren't comfortable with the assignment. They had worked with Marvin for years, had created some of Motown's most iconic recordings with him, but they also knew that Marvin had changed. The man who used to joke with them in the studio, who used to challenge them to musical duels, who used to light up when the groove was right, that man had disappeared somewhere between 1967 and 1971. The Marvin they saw now was a ghost, thin, quiet, eyes always somewhere else. And when Gordy asked them to test him to see if he still had fire, the Funk Brothers agreed. Not because they wanted to break him, but because they needed to know if there was anything left to break. When Marvin finally walked into Studio A just after midnight, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His beard was unkempt. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he moved with the slow, careful gait of someone trying not to fall apart. He didn't apologize for being late. He just nodded at the musicians, took off his jacket, and walked into the vocal booth without a word. Jamerson looked at Benjamin. Benjamin looked at Van Dyke. No one said anything. They just started playing. The arrangement they had prepared was brutal by Motown standards. Jamerson's bass line wasn't the smooth melodic foundation he usually created for Marvin's romantic ballads. It was thick, pulsing, almost violent in its insistence. Benjamin's drums weren't subtle. They were heavy, demanding, pushing the tempo forward with a relentlessness that left no room for softness. Van Dyke's piano chords stabbed rather than caressed. This wasn't a love song. This was a challenge. This was the Funk Brothers saying, if you want to sing about sex and healing, you better have the strength to match what we're laying down. In the vocal booth, Marvin stood in front of the microphone, headphones on, listening to the track. His face showed nothing. No fear, no excitement, nothing. He closed his eyes, and for a long moment, he just stood there, breathing. The engineers in the control room exchanged glances. Gordy leaned forward in his chair, waiting. Behind his closed eyelids, Marvin wasn't in the studio. He was back in 1967, holding Tammy as she collapsed on stage in Virginia. He could still feel the weight of her body going limp in his arms, still hear the confusion in her voice when she tried to remember the lyrics and couldn't. He thought about the 3 years that followed, hospital rooms, brain surgeries, the gradual dimming of her light. And he thought about what Tammy had told him near the end, when she knew she was dying and he was still pretending she might recover. She had said, "When I'm gone, you're going to feel more alone than you've ever felt, and you'll have to decide if you're going to hide from that or sing from it." Marvin had spent the year after her death hiding, refusing to perform live, shutting down, running from the emptiness. But standing in this booth now, with aggressive music pounding in his headphones, Music designed to provoke him into being strong. He realized he couldn't hide anymore. He didn't have the energy for it. Strength required fuel, and he had none left. All he had was the wound. So that's what he would give them. Not the performance they wanted, but the truth they hadn't asked for. And then Marvin started to sing, but what came out of his mouth wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't the aggressive, masculine performance that Gordy wanted. It wasn't the smooth, seductive voice that had made Marvin famous. It was something else entirely. Marvin's voice was fragile, almost breaking. Every note sounded like it cost him something. He wasn't singing about desire. He was singing about need. Desperate, aching, unbearable need. The kind of need that comes from being alone too long, from losing someone you can't replace, from trying to fill a void that nothing can fill. In the studio, something strange started to happen. Jamerson, who had been playing with mechanical precision, found himself slowing down. Not intentionally, not consciously, but his hands wouldn't maintain the aggressive attack. The bass line softened, became more melodic, more supportive. Benjamin, who had been pounding the drums with the force Gordy had asked for, started pulling back. His hits became lighter, more delicate. The relentless forward momentum gave way to something more spacious, more vulnerable. Van Dyke's stabbing piano chords transformed into something gentler, something that curved around Marvin's voice instead of challenging it. No one had told them to change. No one had signaled them to adjust. But the Funk Brothers, some of the most technically skilled musicians in the world, found themselves unable to maintain the test they had been given. Because what they heard in Marvin's voice wasn't weakness. It was truth. Raw, unfiltered, devastating truth. And in the presence of that truth, their technical virtuosity felt suddenly meaningless. When the take ended, there was silence. Marvin opened his eyes, took off his headphones, and stood there waiting. Waiting for notes, waiting for criticism, waiting for someone to tell him he wasn't good enough. But no one spoke. Jamerson was staring at his bass like he didn't recognize it. Benjamin had put his drumsticks down and was looking at his hands. Van Dyke was frozen at the piano, his fingers still resting on the keys. Gordy, watching from the control room, pressed the talkback button. "Let's do another take," he said. His voice sounded uncertain. They ran the song again. And again, the same thing happened. The Funk Brothers came in with the aggressive arrangement, ready to push, ready to challenge. And again, Marvin's voice dismantled them, not through power, not through technique, but through absolute, undefended vulnerability. He was singing about sex, yes, but beneath every word was grief. Beneath every note was the memory of Tammy Terrell collapsing in his arms. Beneath the plea for physical healing was a deeper plea for something that no touch could fix. And the musicians heard it, all of it. After the third take, Jamerson spoke. He turned to Gordy, who had come down from the control room to stand in the studio doorway. "I can't do what you asked," Jamerson said quietly. "I'm not good enough." Gordy looked confused. James Jamerson, the most respected bass player in the world, was saying he wasn't good enough. "What are you talking about?" Gordy asked. Jamerson gestured toward the vocal booth where Marvin stood, still waiting, still quiet. "He's not performing," Jamerson said. "He's bleeding, and I can't pretend that what I'm playing matters more than that." Benjamin nodded in agreement. "I thought we were testing him," the drummer said, "but he's the one who tested us, and we failed." Gordy stood there trying to understand what was happening. He had brought in the Funk Brothers to push Marvin, to force him to prove he still had the strength to be a star. But the opposite had occurred. Marvin, by refusing to be strong, by refusing to hide his damage, had revealed something that made strength irrelevant. He had shown them that there was a depth beyond technique, a place where skill and polish and professionalism didn't matter, a place where only truth existed. And none of them, not even the legendary Funk Brothers, knew how to operate in that place. They recorded the rest of Let's Get It On that night, but the dynamic had completely shifted. The Funk Brothers weren't trying to challenge Marvin anymore. They were trying to support him. They were listening to him in a way they had never listened to anyone before. Not as musicians following a singer, but as witnesses to something sacred, something they didn't fully understand, but couldn't deny. When the session ended just before dawn, Marvin thanked them quietly and left. The Funk Brothers stayed behind, packing up their instruments in silence. Jamerson was the first to leave, walking out into the cold Detroit morning with his bass case. He sat in his car for 10 minutes before starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel, trying to name what he was feeling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was something closer to grief. Not for Marvin, but for himself. For all the years he had believed that mastery was the highest achievement, that if you could play faster, smoother, more complex than anyone else, you had reached the summit. But what he had heard in that booth had nothing to do with mastery. It had to do with surrender. And surrender was a place Jamerson had never been, had never wanted to go. But now that he had witnessed it, his own virtuosity felt suddenly hollow, like technique without meaning, like words without belief. Benjamin left next, driving through empty streets as the sun started to rise. He kept thinking about the moment when he had pulled back on the drums, when his hands had refused to maintain the aggressive attack. He had played with everyone, had created some of the most influential drum patterns in popular music. But he had always been in control, always knew what he was doing and why. Tonight, his hands had acted without his permission. They had heard something in Marvin's voice that his mind hadn't fully processed yet, and they had responded with an instinct older than technique. The instinct to protect, to support, to not hurt what was already broken. Finally, Earl Van Dyke was at the door, bass case in hand. He turned back to look at the studio, at the vocal booth where Marvin had stood, at the space where something irreversible had happened. "He's not one of us," Jamerson said, not as an insult, not as a compliment, just as a fact. "We're musicians. He's something else." He paused. "Something more expensive?" The session became legendary within Motown, though the story was rarely told outside the inner circle. Word spread among the studio musicians that something had happened during the "Let's Get It On" recording. That Marvin Gaye had broken the Funk Brothers without trying, that he had turned a test into a surrender, and after that night no one at Motown tried to challenge Marvin again. Not because they were afraid of him, but because they had seen what he was carrying, and none of them wanted to be responsible for making him carry it alone. Gordy never asked the Funk Brothers to push Marvin again. He had wanted to know if the old Marvin still existed, if the Prince of Soul was still in there. He got his answer. The old Marvin was gone, and the new Marvin, the broken one, the one who sang from a place of irreparable damage, was more powerful than the old one had ever been. Not in spite of his wounds, because of them. James Jamerson died in 1983, but in one of his last interviews, he was asked about the greatest session he ever played on. He didn't talk about Motown hits or songs that sold millions. He paused and said, "The session that changed me was Marvin Gaye, 1971. We thought we were going to show him what we could do. Instead, he showed us what we couldn't do. He showed us that there's a level of honesty that technique can't touch. And once you hear that, you can't unhear it." For Marvin, the session was just another night where he showed up and bled through a microphone, because that was the only thing he knew how to do anymore. He didn't think about breaking anyone. He just sang because singing was the only alternative to silence, and silence was unbearable. The album Let's Get It On became one of Marvin's biggest commercial successes. Critics praised it as a masterpiece, but the people who were in Studio A that night heard something different. They heard a man who had walked into a test and turned it into a confession. A man who had been given a challenge and responded with truth so raw that the challengers had no choice but to surrender. And in the years that followed, whenever young musicians at Motown would talk about wanting to be great, the Funk Brothers would tell them about that night. They would say, "Greatness isn't about being the best. It's about being the most honest. And honesty at that level costs everything." The lesson wasn't about music. It was about being human, about the difference between performing emotion and living inside it, about the space between singing about pain and singing from pain, and about how sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop pretending you're strong and just let everyone see how broken you really are. That's what Marvin did, not because he was brave, but because he had nothing left to hide behind. And when all the masks are gone, all that remains is truth. And truth, it turns out, is the one thing that virtuosity cannot defeat.